The first crack in the barn floor looked like nothing. The second looked like weather. By the sixth, Margaret Colby stopped sweeping and knelt down with her palm flat against the concrete. Not random cracks, not the kind that come from 40 winters of frost and thaw. 6 cracks, same direction, same width, spreading from the north wall toward the grain bins like fingers reaching across the floor. Margaret had run Colby Dairy alone for 11 years since Thomas died, and in 11 years, the barn had never once told her a lie. It was telling her something now. She called her daughter Ruth in from the milking parlor. Ruth was 26, home from Ohio State with an agriculture degree nobody in the family quite understood yet, and she crouched beside her mother without being asked twice. She ran her fingers along the crack. Dry, old dust inside it, not fresh. This has been opening slow. How slow? Ruth didn't answer. She stood and looked at the north wall, where a water stain had crept halfway up the fieldstone foundation, dark and permanent looking, like the barn itself was sweating from somewhere underground. 3 weeks earlier, nothing on Colby Dairy looked unusual enough to stop for. The farm sat on 140 acres outside Willow Creek, Vermont, on a slope that dropped gently from the old farmhouse down through hay fields toward Miller's Run, the creek that had given the town its name. The barn stood at the crest of that slope, built by Margaret's grandfather in 1948, holding 40 head of Holsteins and a hayloft that still smelled like every summer Margaret had ever lived through. Spring had come in wet that year, not flood wet, the kind that soaks in and stays day after gray day, until the ground stopped being ground and started being something softer underneath. Margaret's first instinct was to call a concrete contractor. Cracked floors happen, foundations settle. She had the number half dialed when Ruth stopped her.
Wait, just wait one day. Margaret lowered the phone. You think it's more than the floor? I think the floor is the last thing to know, not the first. They walked the barn together that evening, the way Margaret hadn't walked it in years. Not really, just moving through it on habit. Now she looked. The old hay door on the north side, which had swung true for decades, dragged against its frame. A support beam overhead, one Thomas himself had replaced 15 years back, sat a half-inch out of level. Margaret pressed her hand against it and felt something she didn't have a word for yet. Not danger exactly, but a kind of tiredness in the wood, like it was holding more than it used to. Outside, the ground told its own story if you knew how to read it. A shallow depression had formed along the base of the north wall, no more than a few inches deep, easy to miss under the grass. Ruth crouched at its edge and pushed a garden stake into the soil. It sank further than it should have. That night it rained. Not hard, just steady, the kind Vermont gets in April, the kind nobody thinks twice about. In the morning, the crack nearest the north wall had widened. Margaret measured it with a ruler from the kitchen drawer, marked the width in pencil on the concrete itself, dated it, April the 9th. She thought about calling her nephew, Daniel, who did soil work for the county extension office 2 towns over, but she hesitated. Calling him made it real. As long as it was just a crack in a floor, it was a repair. The moment somebody with a title looked at it, it might become something else. It was Ruth who called him. Daniel arrived on a Thursday, 60 years old, quiet, the kind of man who looked at a problem for a long time before he said anything about it. He didn't start in the barn. He started outside, walking the slope above it, then the fields to either side, then, finally, the barn itself. Floor first, then walls, then the beam Margaret had noticed.
He didn't call it a landslide. He didn't call it anything, not that first day. He asked Margaret for the farm's old records, any drainage work, any ditches, anything her grandfather might have built and nobody maintained. Margaret didn't think there was anything like that, but in a tin box in the farmhouse attic, under insurance papers and expired seed catalogs, Ruth found a hand-drawn map, brittle and yellowed, dated 1951. It showed the barn, the slope, and a thin dotted line running along the hillside above it, labeled in her great-grandfather's blocky handwriting, "Drain ditch, keep clear." Nobody alive had kept it clear. They walked the hillside above the barn with the map in hand and found it eventually, not a ditch anymore, just a shallow trace in the land, filled in by 70 years of leaves and grass and nobody thinking about it. Water that once would have been carried sideways around the barn now ran straight down into it, soaking into ground that had never been built to hold that much. Daniel put a probe into the soil above the north wall, topsoil, then loam, and at about 2.5 feet, a dense layer of clay, slick when he scraped it, holding water like a shelf. Below the barn, on ground the old ditch used to protect, that clay sat closer to the surface, saturated, patient. "It's not the whole hillside," Daniel said. "It's a strip, maybe half an acre, moving slow, right under your north wall." Margaret stood in the barn doorway looking at 40 cows she had to milk twice a day on ground somebody was telling her might not hold. How slow is slow? Slow enough that your grandfather's ditch held it for 70 years without anyone noticing there was anything to hold. They didn't panic, they measured. Daniel set reference stakes outside the affected strip and inside it, the way he'd learned doing this work for the county, nails driven into fixed points.
String lines run taut, the same tape pulled the same way every time, so small numbers couldn't lie to them by accident. Ruth kept the notebook. Margaret kept walking the barn floor every morning before milking, checking her pencil marks against the crack. After the next rain, the stakes inside the strip moved, a 1/4 inch. The reference stakes outside it didn't move at all. Margaret sat on the milking stool that evening longer than she needed to, hands still smelling of the cows, and let herself feel the weight of it. 40 years in this barn between her and Thomas, and now her alone. A crack in the floor had become a hillside with a mind of its own, moving under the animals she loved, on ground her own family had once known how to protect and had simply, quietly forgotten. Ruth found her there, sat down beside her without saying anything for a while. "We don't have to lose the barn," Ruth finally said. "We might have to change how we use it. That's not losing it, that's listening to it." They rebuilt the old ditch first, not as a grand project, just the 40 feet directly above the north wall, angled to carry water sideways into the hayfield instead of straight down into the barn's foundation. They moved the youngest heifers to the south end of the barn, off the affected strip, while they watched what the ground would do. Daniel told them plainly it might take a full wet season to know if the ditch alone was enough, and Margaret, who had never been a patient woman, made herself wait anyway. The cracks stopped widening within 3 weeks. The beam that sat out of level held steady at its new resting point and moved no further. Margaret kept measuring anyway, every morning, pencil marks accumulating down the side of the concrete like a diary written in a language only she and Ruth could read. In June, the biggest storm of the year came through, nearly 2 inches overnight. Margaret didn't sleep. She was in the barn before dawn with a flashlight, checking the stakes, checking the crack, checking the beam. The ditch had done its work. Water pooled in the hayfield
Was meant to, not against the foundation. The crack, when she measured it, had not moved a hair since May. She sat down on the same milking stool and cried for the first time in longer than she could remember. Not from fear this time, but from something closer to relief, the kind that only comes after you've been afraid of losing something and then don't. Daniel came by a week later, walked the barn once more, quiet as always. "Stable?" Margaret asked. "Stable enough to trust." He looked at her. "That's different from stable forever. Land like this, you don't finish watching it. You just get better at listening." Margaret nodded like she'd known that all along, though she hadn't, not really, not until a crack in a concrete floor had taught her. That fall, the barn stood the way it always had, 40 cows inside it, the north wall dry, the old family ditch doing quietly what it had done for her grandfather 70 years before anyone forgot it mattered. Margaret never did patch that first crack. She left it there, faint pencil marks still visible beside it if you knew where to look, a small, ugly line in the concrete that at once told her the truth before anything else on the farm was willing to. If a floor in your own barn started cracking in a straight line tomorrow, would you patch it, or would you ask what it was trying to tell you first? Some things on a farm don't fail loudly. They lean, they crack, they widen a quarter inch at a time, and the people who listen early are the ones who keep what they love. Sometimes the smallest, ugliest crack in the floor is the only warning you'll ever get before it's too late to save what's standing